Hi guys, and welcome to China Perspective. My name is 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝘁 and you may know me as a German recruiter in Asia. Today we're going to explore a critical topic for anyone working in China or with China. The evolution of localization strategies by Western firms from localization 1.0 to 3.0, and why localization 3.0 is not only the hottest buzzword that we hear about right now, but also absolutely essential for international firms operating in the market right here. In fact, recent government changes make it necessary to increase the level of localization here in China drastically. So if you are a foreign firm and you're still stuck in localization 1.0 or 2.0, then please be very mindful of the challenges that you will face, on top of the price pressure and the increasing local competition and a slow market. So let's get started with a very simple definition. What is localization? Well, localization, simply put, is how companies adapt their products and services and operations to fit a specific market, in this case, China. All companies entering a new country always have an immediate approach to localization, but there are different levels to it. So in China, this process has evolved dramatically over the last 30 or so years, closely mirroring the country's transformation from a low-cost production hub and the World Bank of the world to the innovation powerhouse of AI, robotics and future technologies that the country has been and continues to transform itself into. Check out my video about the AI industry or how China is out-innovating the West. I'm linking both of those in the description below for you. We can think of this kind of evolution in 3 waves. Each wave reflects a deeper, more strategic level of engagement with China's very unique and especially very quickly changing market dynamics and their consumer behavior as salaries have increased. Western brands became known over time, but for example, now we see a strong increase in preference for local brands again, as patriotism or 𝗍𝗄𝗄𝗧, which translates to love country, is fashionable amongst especially also the younger generations. This is paired with a regulatory environment that has matured tremendously and an increasing digital economy. I don't think I've seen a bill of cash in 3 years or so, and it is almost as common to order coffee to be delivered up to the office instead of just going downstairs to the shop. So understanding these 3 waves of localization helps you see why what worked 10 years or even 5 years ago will not cut it anymore. And given that many, I don't want to say most, but I also would not exclude it, many foreign firms are currently facing strong headwinds, not only with a slow economy, but also with an increased Chinese competition and fierce price pressure, putting profit margins in hot water. Localization is possibly one of the few ways forward for these Western firms to keep their foot in the door of this ginormous market. So let's look at localization wave 1.0, the early days. So this was actually before my time, even though I've been in China for 17 years, almost 18 years. So localization 1.0 dates back to the 1980s and 1990s, as China began opening up its economy under Deng Xiaoping's reform and later joined the WTO in 2001. That joining process was preceded by 15 years of negotiation, by the way. Just another hint to show you how unrealistic it is to expect to have large trade agreements be completed within 30 or 90 days. Just saying. Western companies back then entered China mostly to take advantage of low labor cost and favorable joint venture terms, not to engage with Chinese consumers here. At that time, the average household wealth was still quite low. So in the first step, manufacturing for export markets such as the US, Europe or other areas was the main motivation. Many companies at that time did not yet think to really focus on the domestic market in terms like in China for China or in China for Asia came much later by and large, despite some exceptions of course. This phase was characterized by limited localization. At that time, Western firms either had production offices or what we call web offices. Those were the easiest, cheapest and quickest to set up. So a web office was never allowed to do actual sales, for example, but back then the enforcement was very relaxed. So many companies, they kind of did what they wanted. Localization at that time meant translating websites into so Chinese, having Chinese instruction manuals and packaging translated into Mandarin with only minimal product or service changes. It was often about compliance and not about customer relevance. It was very minimal and often felt a little bit like an afterthought compared to the much more profitable markets abroad. Management then was expat heavy, and I mean really, really, really expat heavy. The majority of Western firms would have a Western GM or a Western CEO here in China. At that time, the English language capability of the Chinese labor force was not as it is now, especially not in smaller cities. Also, decision-making power stayed with the headquarters. Few companies conducted China-specific market research or really invested in understanding local preferences. Think of it as lipstick localization. The interface changed, but the underlying offering didn't. And unsurprisingly, this led to cultural misfires, frictions with regulators, and underwhelming market performance. But China very graciously forgave all of that, or at least most of it. This was the time when China called the West the big brother and welcomed most of Western firms with quite open arms, inviting them to come, to create jobs and to share their know-how. China has always very consciously done this and communicated this strategy as learning from the brother in the West. If you don't know, in China it is quite common to give somebody a title from a family member. So you would call people on the street, or if you have a driver or a maid, you would call them uncle or auntie. So this has a quite positive connotation and is done frequently. Then in the 2000s and 2010 we saw the second wave of localization and things began to shift. So Localization 2.0 emerged as China's middle class expanded and competition intensified. This wave was about investing in local operations, not just to produce in China, but also to sell to China. This was directly related to the increase in purchasing power of the local people. All of a sudden, they became very interesting as a consumer market. Companies established local manufacturing facilities, hired more Chinese staff, and created marketing campaigns tailored to Chinese consumers. At that time, often badly so, at least when I see it today, I did cringe a little bit on the inside. But at that time, many people in China still associated Western or foreign products automatically with a superior quality. So often the debatable advertisement and mishaps in communication was easily forgiven or even cherished. HR, sales and operation teams were increasingly staffed by locals, and the overall skill, be it technical, language-wise or functional, increased a lot. Companies started to see the domestic market with a lot more clarity, and the green dollar signs came up in their eyes due to the sheer size and the steady increase in purchasing power, plus the double-digit economic growth the country had each year. I remember, then I was already here at this time. We always say, to not grow in China during those years, you would have to make colossal errors in your business. Nowadays, of course, you have to do a lot of things right to even just survive and grow a little bit. But back then, brands began modifying global products to better match local preferences. You saw different packaging designs, China-specific flavor variants. So, for example, I had one summer of green tea ice cream addiction, which is not sweet actually, and I couldn't decide whether to be happy or not to have chocolate in China or be sad, because I always tended to be this really sweet Dove milk chocolate with not a very lot of cocoa in it, compared to what I like, being a 95% dark chocolate. But Chinese at that time, they preferred very sweet chocolate to get used to it, as it was not always part of the Chinese cuisine. So at this time, the West was still revered and appreciated. You had famous architects like Mr. Kohlhaas or Zaha Hadid being invited to China to design huge, amazing looking buildings, and the upper middle class would go to an Italian or even a French restaurant, loving to order red wine, and the TV show Friends was all the rage, and I'm sure the absolutely large majority of young people during that time watched it. Also, the internet was still a lot freer. I was here when Facebook first came up and connected everyone, including the Chinese people, which of course changed later on, and now we have a heavily managed internet experience, or as we lovingly call it, a heavily harmonized internet experience. Everything was geared towards growth, and you as a company had a lot of leeway to do what you wanted. As long as you were successful, you usually got away with it. For example, German automotive companies expanded local production capacity to meet explosive demand, but still retained control of vehicle design and engineering abroad. Localization 2.0 was deeper than before, but strategic autonomy remained with the headquarters, who gave global guidelines and made the big decisions that had to be followed by the Chinese daughter firms. At the same time, Chinese talent was rising. Local managers began climbing the corporate ladder, but the full decision-making authority remained elusive, even though we saw the first Chinese GMs making their way to the top of Western firms. During this time, many Chinese also went overseas, including to countries like Germany, for example, to study, and then come back to China to work for example, for German companies. So these really were the good times. These were the end of the golden times, and I'm personally very, very grateful to have been here during these times, because I got to experience what unhindered growth can look like, and I saw the beauty and the development of the country, as well as the peoples and the system. I was here when social systems got introduced, replacing, for example, bartering a chicken in the countryside for a doctor's visit and replacing it with universal medical care. I was here when Yao Ming, remember the very tall basketball player, went on TV and told people to stop eating shark fin soup. And this is how animal protection movements were born, which fight until today to end some very traditional customs of, for example, eating dog meat in autumn. Dog meat is supposed to have warming qualities, and that is why it's considered an autumn food. But before you get a heart attack, only a very, very small number of Chinese actually eat dog meat. This was a geographically localized custom that is experiencing strong pressure domestically to stop. And it is really not as common as some, sensationalist news reports would make you believe. But as China's digital ecosystem matured and as geopolitical risks increased, the old model started to break. China is no longer a secondary market. It was fast becoming the global testbed for innovation and a huge and major local market with increasing importance to not only the domestic context, but also in China for Asia and in China for Africa and in China for BRICS context. China has gotten a lot more powerful and a lot more professional and a lot more important and a lot more influential and a lot more wealthy and a lot more confident. And this is why we are now in the middle of the third wave of localization. So localization 3.0, you also can call it deep integration. And we can best describe it as a strategic pivot from adaptation to integration. And part of this is driven by a need to localize to be more competitive in a slow market and amid very fierce competition from Chinese firms and other Western firms, of course, who have matured greatly and are taking more and more market share of the parts of the market that previously were occupied by foreign firms. Additionally, we see more and more initiatives by the Chinese government, which can be summarized in a China-first mentality. Similar to what other countries are doing, China is strongly requiring companies to produce here and fully integrate into the market, lest the firms be excluded from participating, for example, in local tenders or biddings, or face a 20% penalty by not having been made in China. That's a discount that other companies can enjoy. So this is a trend which in itself is not new, and other countries do exactly the same. Still, I feel that not all international companies understand the magnitude of this change. So in China, foreign companies no longer just localize, they embed. They empower their China teams with end-to-end responsibility, from product development to marketing to compliance, all tailored specifically to China. And that means setting up an R&D center staffed by local engineers. It means launching China-first products that never existed globally. It means adopting China's fast-paced digital infrastructure as a default, not the exception. It means complying fully with local laws like the Personal Information Protection Law, which went into effect a few years ago in 2021, and others. China is now on the brink of starting to dictate what is happening globally. Think of EV companies, for example, designing cars specifically for the Chinese consumers, which are now being exported into many other countries. Multinationals now see China not only as a market, but as an R&D hub. And increasingly, Chinese executives are leading not just national, but regional or even global operations. In fact, as a recruiter, I would say that we've started to see the largest wave of localization across executive roles for Western companies since summer 2023. The headquarters of these Western firms decided they wanted to localize their China leadership team and let many of the previous Western executives go and replace them, and are still replacing them with Chinese individuals. And you know what? There is ample talent to choose from in the very mature China talent market. While I personally do not believe that the qualification of a leader depends on his or her passport, there are some strengths which are unique to each Western and Chinese executive. So right now, we are in the times of the Chinese one. However, as a recruiter, I can say these trends tend to come in waves, and we will at some point see a new kind of foreigner, possibly younger than the previous, old China hand foreigner who also speaks fluent Chinese, emerge as an attractive new leadership role. And why? Because China is innovating faster. And China is increasingly setting the standards, not just following them. But while all of that sounds easy, deep localization is not without risks, and many Western firms have to deal with a very complex business environment today. Of course, a risk we have to mention are the geopolitical risks. The US-China tensions have transformed supply chains into security risks. Export controls, sanctions and investment restrictions can disrupt operations overnight. Then there's also IP leakage. More R&D on the ground increases exposure. Many firms remember the tech transfers they had to agree to in order to be able to enter the Chinese market, and the story of copyright issues. However, if I'm honest, even though Western firms are still innovating a lot and some of their global innovation also happens here, I really think that the Chinese are taking the cake. Not only when it comes to the number of patents they file each year, but also the speed and diversification into other product areas, especially future-related product categories they are ushering in, and which I would expect them to lead in the extremely near future. Nevertheless, protecting IP still requires safeguards and attention. And then there's the risk of regulatory volatility. Laws on data, cybersecurity, ESG, and anti-monopoly are evolving fast. Compliance isn't optional, and penalties are very high. While the law on paper is valid for everyone, it is a real-life reality that foreign companies are measured much stricter and have less wiggle room than local ones. The audits are infamous. Local companies have a lot more leeway in a lot more areas still. We will see how clear data categories are defined, how the legal certainty will be improved, and how secure, fast data channels will be enabled. And then there's of course the cultural risk. Misreading local sentiment or mishandling a social media campaign can really backfire spectacularly. The Chinese online community is fast and vocal. Chinese tend to be more and more critical of brands, and Chinese are actually very, very outspoken and very easy to be angry about these things. Remember when a Western washing machine manufacturer did not return a faulty or broken machine, and the Chinese guy brought it in front of the company and, with publicity, smashed it with a hammer? Or the public outcry that happens each time a Western luxury brand, or the Pradas and Guccis of this world, shoots their shot at a campaign with Chinese characteristics which are then considered disrespectful in Chinese. The Chinese people are very, very proud of their culture and heritage, and it is very easy and very dangerous for a Western firm to make a mistake here. And then the immediate reaction for the people is to be outraged and insulted. So what we hear often is that, I quote, "the feelings of the Chinese people have been hurt, and this demands a public apology." And while no CEO on this planet wants to apologize to any country for a not thought through marketing campaign, in which very likely he or she was not even involved, this has an additional facet of losing face in the Asia context and can be seen as a kowtow to the Chinese people. There are some domestic operations and market access rules as well. Some rules are favoring domestic products and are disadvantaging foreign companies. Uneven market access, even still today, despite it getting better, is also a topic. Local protectionism persists, even for highly localized firms, and simple issues with the gap between local suppliers and what is needed for a proper integration of all products. And then another challenge is data localization. Cross-border data flows are tightly controlled under laws of China and the cybersecurity law, for example. Companies must rethink global data architecture to remain compliant while maintaining operational efficiency, and often their global systems will not be feasible to work here. But despite these challenges, the upsides are significant. In some cases, products developed in China are being exported to Southeast Asia, Latin America, or even back to Western markets. There's a sign of a strategic maturity. So the question is, how can companies get localization 3.0 right? Well, first of all, localize your supply chain and build redundancy. It is also recommended to reduce over-reliance on global imports. Also invest in local R&D, and I know that's a point of contention in headquarters, but install safeguards. Maybe separate core IP, implement legal protections, and develop cross-border governance. Hoping that we see a further increase in stronger local enforcement, cross-provincial coordination, and better court success rates. And of course, empower the China leadership further. Gives them real P&L responsibility and real freedom to act. The headquarters has to let go of control if they want to succeed in China. And also add embedded compliance expertise. You need teams that understand both the letter and the spirit of Chinese regulations. Please try and conduct deeper user testing, so going beyond translation, validating user experience, pricing, cultural tone, and digital engagement. So please do not let your global marketing team decide that. And also, please don't sleep on all the China digital platforms. Operate like a local brand on WeChat, Douyin, Xiaohongshu, and beyond. And make sure you keep up to date. What was WeChat channel 3 years ago is Xiaohongshu today, and God knows what tomorrow. Also keep in mind, please, the different customer segmentations. It's important to monitor and to adapt also to the regulatory, consumer, and geopolitical environments, because those shift fast. Building a team that can pivot quickly is invaluable. Headquarters has to let go, but at the same time foster regular exchange. China silos do not help anyone, and closing the eyes does not help either. The market here is hyper-competitive and moving at China's speed. Please try and support education and recruitment of internationally minded talent, no matter their passport. But of course, as companies try their hand at this deep integration, we also see some common problems occur. For example, treating localization 3.0 like a checklist, not like a proper strategy, and not having the full stakeholder buy-in at home. A common challenge is to just be copying global playbooks instead of creating another one for China. China is different and is literally rewriting the book. You also have likely not dealt with such a large market that is so different to your home market. And yes, US and Europe and everything is also different, but China is different. You cannot just copy and paste your past experience, and you probably need younger people who understand China today and not China 20 years ago to do it successfully today and in the future. Another common mistake is delaying local decision-making and approvals, or underestimating the cost of non-compliance and the rule of law in China, which will hit you as a foreign firm with all its might. A challenge is also to ignore or trivialize local partnerships, which often determine long-term success, or at the same time being blind or doe-eyed and not being careful to protect your own interest. So guys, thank you so much for listening to this little personal history class on how localization in China has gone from superficial translation to operational presence with limited autonomy, and today to full strategic integration and innovation in localization 3.0. Overall, it's not a trend, it's not a buzzword, it's a reality of competing in one of the world's most complex and most dynamic markets. If you're still doing China 2.0, it's time to evolve. Because in 2025 and beyond, localization 3.0 is not just smart, it's a price of admission. And in many cases, a price for simple survival in this market. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe. It really helps my channel grow, and I would really appreciate a positive sign for you. Thank you guys, bye.